Hi, good morning. My name is Jessica Shelley, and I'm the co-founder and head educator at Dailies. Today we have Jennifer Blanchard, one of our talented DailiesPods educators, with us today to talk about a topic that she is passionate about in the field of education. Jennifer, go ahead and give us a quick introduction to yourself and tell us a little bit about why you like working at Dailies.
Yeah, so I've been a teacher at Dailies since October, and I've loved every minute of it. What I especially love about it is that we get to have social interactions with kids while they're learning important academic content. So we make it engaging, we make it fun, but we're also making sure that we're meeting standards and getting the students where they need to be.
Excellent, excellent. And then what is something that you like to do for fun?
I love to read, so I've always been a big reader. I read about 60 books a year, which is pretty crazy. Yeah, so that's how I enjoy my time. I'm a big literacy person, and as you'll see today, that's the topic that we're talking about. So that's where my interest lies.
Excellent. So let's start with a little bit more about the topic that you selected. Tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, so the topic is balanced literacy, and I chose this topic just because I feel like it's a term that parents might come across when they're doing research for how can they better help their student at home, or even they might hear that that's a term that's being used in their student's classroom, whether it's in a physical classroom or what we're doing at Dailies. We integrate it into our pods too. So I just wanted parents to feel like they had some better understanding about it. So balanced literacy, it started in about 1996, which I looked that up. It was pretty surprising. Since I've joined the educational field, it's been a part of what we do, integrated into every content area. And so what it is it's really just a focus on teaching reading, writing, but also speaking and listening and having it all integrated. So not teaching those skills in isolation, but having a balance of all of them coming together and teaching them in that way too.
Excellent, excellent. So can you tell me a little bit about, like, maybe give me an example or something about how that might look integrated?
Yeah, so I'll give an example 1 minute. I also want to be sure to say that it is a balance between the whole language. So teaching the student through exposure, through experiences, through authentic literature, but also teaching some phonics skills. So that is kind of a debate that you might hear if you do some further research into education right now is, should we be teaching our kids solely phonics? Should we be teaching them solely
Hmm.
guided reading and other terms that you'll hear that go along with balanced literacy? And that's where that term balanced comes in, is that it truly is a mixture of both. The kids need that direct structured instruction of what letter sounds go along with each letter, but then also they need to be exposed to that great literature in real settings, how they'd encounter it in the real world. So an example of balanced literacy, we're going to go into the components in just a minute, but it would be taking a book to use with your child and maybe teaching some of the letter patterns, letter sounds, but then also looking at comprehension as a whole of, okay, what is this book teaching us? What are different themes that we can look at in this book? So that would just be a very basic example.
Excellent, excellent. That sounds like a very widened and wholesome approach to literacy instruction. Also very reminiscent of my time teaching kindergarten, first grade in the classroom, and we had that kind of lens and focus too. So I'm excited to talk about this a little bit more with you today. But go ahead and kind of expand a little bit more on what you can tell us about balanced literacy.
Yeah, so I also want to be sure to mention that when we're looking at reading and writing skills, there's so many different pieces. It's not just, okay, what letter does
Mhm.
a sound make, like I mentioned with phonics, and that's it. We also need to look at fluency. So are the students, or is your child reading the word accurately, reading it with expression, pausing at correct spots? Another component would be vocabulary. So are they taking in and learning new words and then applying those to new contexts? And then also, looking at that comprehension piece that I briefly mentioned on. So there's a lot of skills that fall under comprehension. That could be its own webinar in itself.
Yes.
But when we're talking about comprehension, we just mean making sense of the book, taking meaning away
Mhm.
from the text. I also want to mention that balanced literacy it goes into whole group instruction, small group instruction, and one-on-one instruction, which is what we do in our pods. So it can be applied through any of those different settings. And it also takes into account something called the gradual release model. So that is the way of teaching that we do at Dailies as well. And it's where the teacher starts off by explaining the skill, explaining the topic, modeling it, the teacher does it herself or himself, and then slowly releasing to get independence for the student, which is the ultimate goal for these kids to be able to take these skills and use them by themselves in everyday life. So it goes from that I do to we do. So the teacher or the parent in this case is they're helping the child, working with them, supporting them and guiding them, and then ultimately releasing to the student, being confident to do it by themselves.
Excellent. And so I guess kind of with that model too, like the first place that parents could start with kind of implementing the gradual release method and model would be like they read the story to their child, then they read it together with their child, focusing on whatever specific skill they're working on, and then seeing if the child can then implement that independently as they read. Would that kind of be the general? Okay.
Yeah. And going back to what you mentioned earlier too, about how it can all be integrated, especially with the reading and writing. So I would suggest for parents as a place to start, and taking this down to a basic level that is still effective for the child, but is something that's doable for parents without necessarily a big education background, is selecting a book for the child. Make sure that book has a skill that you could teach a reading skill in and also a writing skill. And so pick that book, model first. You could do a reading skill first. Parent teaches that skill, shows how the parent is using that skill themselves, supporting the student with that skill, and then even finding another similar book for the student to try that skill out for themselves. Sometimes it might require a different book. Sometimes it can be the same book where they can just apply that skill in a different setting.
Hey, it's okay.
Okay.
It happens. It happens. We're all working from home. We're a virtual company, so you never know.
We are.
But yeah.
So, but then also, okay, so that's kind of the structure going through the reading viewpoint, but then tying in the writing. So, okay, let's use the same book. Let's look at a writing skill that we can teach. Same exact method that the parent just went through. So teach that writing skill now, model it, sit there, support the student or the child with it, and then let the child try it out for themselves, either on that same writing piece that you've been working on or applying it to a different writing piece.
Excellent. And many of our families that we currently have enrolled in the program, as you know, are usually at like the pre-K, or we have a pre-K bridge class, which is our advanced pre-K offering focusing on kindergarten readiness. So as far as the specific, like one specific reading skill that you would say is like the very beginning of a reading journey, and then maybe one writing skill that you think would be the beginning of a writing journey, what would you say that parents could focus on at the very beginning if they're starting this with their kids?
Yeah, very beginning, I would say, would be concepts of print. So just this is where you see the student being exposed to text, and then you're also directly teaching skills. So there's a title on the cover of the book. This is a cover. There's an author's name. This is how we turn the pages and we read from top to bottom, left to right. Just those skills that seem second nature to us and that we would think, okay, we can skip right over and let's jump right into maybe forming a letter. But that would be the first place to start, is just getting them aware of and noticing all those parts of a text that are essential. And then building off of that. So a writing skill would be, they can, if they're working on writing their name, having them write it in the certain direction, left to right, going along with the words that we just saw in the book, going from left to right. And having discussion about both of those, how they're going hand in hand. Those skills go together.
Excellent. Yeah. And I remember actually this kindergarten lesson that I used to teach at the very beginning of the year, and they would have their little book boxes and they'd pull out their book, and we would just talk about how to hold a book and how to turn the pages gently, because they get so excited to see what's coming next in the story that sometimes it's a little aggressive.
Yeah,
so
it's
even
true.
Just like opening the book, holding the book, noticing those things on the cover page, and then kind of going through, I think that those are great moments that the parents can share with their kids at home, especially even if the parent is reading aloud. Something I do with my kids too is I have them hold the book and I just read the words, because then they still feel engaged, and it kind of helps it lend itself to the next part, which would be like following along or tracking print of like, oh, now it's time to turn the page, so just working on those kind of skills too, as they maybe advance through those preliminary, how to hold the book and how to find the information quickly on there. So
and then building off of that, so that would be kind of the basic skill. The more middle level skill that you were asking about could be introducing sight words or high frequency words, or just words that kids are working with a lot in text that are at their level. So these are words like, the, and just commonly used words. And so you could, the parent could take it through a book first by having the student noticing the words in the book after the parent models pointing out where those words are in the book, and then carry that over to writing by then having the child write some of those sight words after noticing them in the book, and then building from there, even starting to put them in short sentences with some help.
Yeah, absolutely. And another great strategy there too, I think it's pretty affordable at like office supply stores, but even like highlighter tape, I'm not sure if you've used that in your lessons, but we used to use like the big books or even just the small books, and the students would like use the highlighter tape to highlight those high frequency words. Kind of doing like a word search, but in the context of an authentic book, which was kind of cool. So yeah, great strategies for parents to try things out with their kids at home. As far as any other information that you wanted to share about balanced literacy that we can discuss today?
Yeah, so I just also want to go into the different pieces. So there's some terms that parents might see come along with the big term of balanced literacy. So balanced literacy is kind of the umbrella, and then underneath it, it's the lesson structure, the basics of what we just talked about, but then there's different components too. So within reading and within writing, you might see something called an interactive read aloud or an interactive writing piece. And so that is what we also kind of talked about, where the parent is there supporting. So in an interactive read aloud, that might look like the parent asking questions to the child, pausing throughout the book. It often helps if those points are pre-planned, if you're teaching a specific skill. So making sure that your questions go along with that skill that you really want to focus on, not to overwhelm the child by asking 50 different types of questions within one book. So that would be what an interactive read aloud would be like. Interactive write aloud would be the parent writing a piece, or even writing. We're gonna have to cut that out. Okay.
Interactive write aloud.
So the interactive write aloud would then be having the parent writing a piece, or even writing the child's name and asking questions, getting the child to notice things throughout, and then even inviting the child to maybe trace it or form part of it with the parent. So then going from there, after that interactive piece, another component that could be used is the shared reading or shared writing. And so there's some confusion between interactive and shared. They're very similar. Shared is just you're more so inviting the child to do it at the same time as you. So there's times and places for all of these skills, but shared reading would be having the child maybe read chorally part of the text with you. Great way for them to work on their fluency, work on expression, for them to just feel more confident because someone is there actually doing it at the same time as them. And so then the same thing would look very similar for the shared writing piece. Writing alongside the parent, both parent and child are working on the same skill. So do you have any questions about the interactive or the shared? I know I'm getting into a lot of terms, and there's a few more I just want to cover just so parents feel like they have some basic understanding of this.
Yeah, I would say, just to kind of clarify too for parents. So when we're talking about the shared kind of approach, those are probably more for like kindergarten, first grade, second grade students, whereas the interactive could be for those really young learners too, because we're just kind of guiding the conversation along, asking about the content that we're creating together.
Exactly. Yeah. So primarily our pods are focused on pre-K, but I know that we do also offer K through 3, and always looking to expand, as you know.
Yes, so, I do.
Yeah. So all these skills, of course, can be just adapted, modified slightly to reach different age learners. So building off of that, then guided reading is another term that you might hear in guided writing. And then I know you come from more of the math world, and there's also guided math.
Yes.
So I'm not talking about guided math, but I believe it has a very similar structure. And so in that approach, typically in a typical classroom, it would be a small group of students, but parents can do this again with their child at home, working with one child, or even if there's siblings or friends at a similar level. And through that guided reading, it's more so the student is taking on slightly more of that independence. So as we're talking through these different models, we're going back to that gradual release of, okay, now the student is showing more responsibility. This is where the student or the child is going to be reading some of those sight words or some more of those words in the book. And the parent will just pop in as needed to discuss, to teach skills and strategies. Again, guided reading can be a whole nother webinar in itself.
Yeah.
There's lots of different approaches, lots of different terms that go along with that. But just so parents are aware of just what some of these ideas are and these strategies are that are working for kids.
Yeah. And I think kind of circling back to the very beginning, it is more about that integrated approach, right? So it's not like, hey, we're just going to teach you, the letter A on this worksheet that we're going to do. That was a printable or whatever it is from the parent. It's more of like, okay, we're going to take that idea of finding the letter A, identifying the letter A. This is mostly for our pre-K learners, of course.
Yeah.
And then opening up a book and seeing if they can find the letter A in the context of a word or in the page, and then read the book with your child and, share that experience, ask them those comprehension questions or ask them to make predictions. What do you think is going to happen next? If you notice that, like the plot is leading up to something, see if they can make a guess, start using some of that language that can really kind of enhance those skills. So even though we have the youngest learners, it really could be that integrated to where then they see the skill, the parent can recognize the skill easily from whatever resource they're using, and then apply that in the context of an authentic piece of children's literature, and then also have the student practice writing. So letter formation. So very basic at the beginning, but you get into some really cool things too as you see your child kind of progress through the skills, because then they can start doing the sight words and they can start reading sentences and they can write their name. They can write their name in a sentence. All of those little victories that can be shared with parents is pretty special too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like one of the best parts of teaching in the classroom is seeing those light bulb moments and like celebrating with kids. And parents aren't necessarily there in the classroom, but they get to be that with dailies. They get to be right there and they get to see the success right after the pod class. Which I think is also pretty incredible. But sorry, we got off on a tangent there.
but it's true.
So happy. Yeah,
it's true. And that's what we do tie into our DailiesPods lessons is every lesson we do make sure that we're cross-curricular with having reading, writing, and math. And those reading and writing skills are so integrated, especially because we have our 1 hour time for that day. And so from what I've seen and what I've experienced, we all are just, okay, let's use this one book. Let's build out as many skills as we can from this one book and touch these content areas while still being effective and getting these kids to master this topic. And so it works really well in the pods. And we do have that balanced literacy approach of, okay, let's read a book. We're reading it for enjoyment, for entertainment, but we also are grasping concepts that we're pulling out and noticing during it. And then we're also taking more of a little phonics lesson or a focus where we can teach a more direct kind of drill and kill skill that these kids, that's where the debate comes in. Like I said, it's do they need just the exposure to books or the worksheets, drills and kills? And that's not what we do at DailiesPods and what we believe in. But there do need to be some components of that direct instruction integrated into all of it.
100%. And we have those resources too that we're integrating into that portal now for parents to really kind of take that sort of angle so we can focus more on like the balanced literacy approach, right? In the classrooms, we don't want kids sitting there doing worksheets all day long. But there is that space for them to check their understanding and to have a conversation based on what they're able to produce in the moment as well. So I think that we've tried to be mindful as much as we can about the parents' role and making it a little easier on them, but then also making sure that they get the highest quality education too in that short amount of time. So it's definitely ingrained in all of the fibers of our partnership with parents and our company and our teachers. And I'm just so grateful that you're here today to kind of share a little bit more about this with us. Is there anything else that you wanted to share about balanced literacy or literacy in general for parents?
I would like to tell parents, don't be overwhelmed by thinking that you need to do all of this all at once. Even when it's presented to teachers, the initial reaction is just overwhelmed. There's so many skills that these kids need to learn. There's so many ways you can go about doing it. There's so many different resources you can pull from on Pinterest or from ours or Teacher Pay Teachers. And it can just definitely be very daunting and overwhelming. But the intention of this today is to kind of take this big concept and look at, how do we make it doable? How can we break it apart and look at the actual specifics of it? And so really all it is just looking at, how are we readers and writers naturally in the world? We don't just write one thing and focus on one skill and then compartmentalize that and move on to something else. Like we do it all naturally together. And so we're trying to get our kids to learn in that way and to see that that's how these skills support each other and work best. So even in a traditional classroom, you wouldn't see all these pieces I talked about every single day. There just isn't enough time. And in our pods, there's not enough time. In a homeschool setting or just in anyone's day, there is not enough time. So I would suggest to parents to find one piece, start with that one piece, build that into what you're already doing or however you're choosing to support your child. And then see if you can add on another piece from there. And if you're covering phonics, more direct phonics instruction, just 2 days a week, that's totally fine if you're covering in these other components the other days of the week too. So don't think that you need to go spend hours of just getting all these pieces in and I need to do all these. These are all just different ideas for what you can be doing for those parents that do want to help their child, but don't necessarily know what's the best approach or where to start.
Yeah. And then also to kind of clarify too for parents, it's not like you said, we don't do it all in the same day in the classroom. It's more of like, hey, we're going to focus on this skill for a couple days. We're going to try it out in the authentic text. We're going to try it out in a writing activity. Yep. And then what we're asking is that they then apply that skill into the next skill that we're also working on. So it's not like we're going to go back and like specifically reteach unless there's an area that they really need extra support in, but it's more about how do they get enough information in that time that we have together and enough application of that skill to then be able to widely, independently apply that as we continue to learn new skills. And that's really how the skills build is it's not necessarily like, oh, I did A yesterday, so today I have to do A and B. It's like, no, we're going to focus on B and we still are going to be checking to make sure that they know A, but not necessarily like full hardcore. Now my lesson went from 30 minutes to an hour because I added an extra letter,
Right.
So
well, and that's
more organic.
And that's a balance piece too, is exactly what you're saying. So, so today our direct instruction, we are focusing our skill, our kind of mini lesson on the letter B. But then when we're going and applying that letter B to a text or a book that we're reading, that's when we can also go back and find the letter A really quickly. And so just spiraling that naturally, like you said, is just what's going to best benefit these kids and when they see how that it's used in real life.
Yeah, and it'll all start clicking too. The farther they kind of get into their reading journey, I think there's a common phrase in the field of education of like kinder through second is learning to read, and then third through fifth or third on is reading to learn. And so it's really like those foundational years of just building their skills and making sure that, we start with letters, of course, and letter sounds in that phonics instruction. Then we work into, the word families like at, how can we rhyme? How can we take away the first sound, put a new sound there to make a new word? How can they recognize that in context? And then really going into like the sentences and the stories and more advanced text then. And then all of a sudden they're reading independently and they're, it's just like that amazing transition of how much they can really do in those first few years to get them ready for, their future educational learnings and things. So
yeah, and going off what you said, I think the modeling is so important too. And that's what we kept referring back to today is a lot of parents sometimes just start with the questioning. But these kids need to see that skill taught to them, explained to them, and then also see how it's used. Like, oh, if my mom or dad or grandma or whoever is using it this way, it's much more visible for them to then see how they need to actually be using it themselves. So that's the big piece going from gradual release and all the other components we're talking about is parent models, show the skill, explain it, sit there and work with your child on it, let your child try it while you're still there as a support, and then let your child try it by themselves.
And also too, just to kind of jump back in, because this is a great conversation. I'm having such a great time. But even some of those like reading skills that we ask for questioning of like, can you tell me about the main character? Or what was something that happened at the beginning? Like, even though that's primarily like a focus of our reading skills, that could also be like, when they are writing their independent pieces, tell me more about the story that you wrote. We're asking those same comprehension of making sure they understand what they wrote.
Yeah.
But also if you have movie night or something too, like ask about the characters in the movie. Like, what was something that happened at the beginning, the middle, and end? Those are still story elements
Yeah.
that parents can focus on in different contexts.
Absolutely.
And that was kind of the approach I brought to math of like, hey, math doesn't have to be this scary thing. Like, it's integrated in every part of your life.
Yeah.
And that was my big heart and mission with that. But even the idea of bringing in science and social studies, and we're talking about things that happened in history, or, oh, well, tell me something that happened yesterday or something today or something tomorrow. Can you make a prediction about what the weather might be? Let's look at this. Let's look at the sky today, using clues to give you information about what could happen. And that's another literacy skill. So we're just kind of talking all about, it doesn't have to be so focused and refined on a story or a book, but more about how those kind of skills can be integrated in, so they start understanding the language and the structure of the question too. It comes back to that modeling and to think aloud of, a parent saying, oh, I predict that it's going to be sunny tomorrow because I don't see a cloud in the sky. It's just more of pouring that language over them, having discussions and conversations. Doesn't necessarily have to be in the context of a book, but that's where we typically see it applied.
So this would be for, more so for those parents that are asking, okay, I do want to sit down with my child. I do want to give that dedicated, committed time, which all parents, of course, want to help their child and are helping in different ways. But this was kind of just the approach for those that are sitting down and looking for more hands-on, what specifically should I be doing? But like you said, there's so many ways to just effortlessly tie these skills in just through discussions and just noticing what's going on in the world around these kids.
Yeah, and I think it just leads more to that idea of, the wholesome learning for a child. You do have that structured time where you're focusing on that skill, but then how do you broaden their understanding in those moments of like, hey, we're rushing off to baseball practice. That was my night last night. And I'm like, oh man, I can see that it's getting a little cold outside, or, just using some of those, like, I notice, I see, I think, I understand. Tell me about your game. Oh my gosh, I have my oldest son call his grandpa after every game and tell him about how it went. And we talk about the beginning, the middle. He always talks about snacks. So, I mean, that's a kid there,
Exactly.
But it really is just about connecting those same skills that you are focused with into other realms of life where it can be a little bit more flowy and fluid. And then when you have those moments, they understand what a prediction is because now they've done it in their reading and they've done it in life. So,
and still having exactly what you're saying, and then still having in the more formal setting. So when they're coming on their pod, or when they're having any other academic setting that they're in, having that planned out, systematic instruction. Just because, going back, that's where balanced literacy kind of came from, is we can't just be throwing all these different things to them or just constantly exposing them if they're not having some structure, some sense of it. So that we keep saying this, but it's true. That's why it truly is balance. It's let's make these well-rounded children by just doing everything that we can to best help them. So
100% intentionality in those moments that you do share with them. And that dedicated time to focus on those skills is really there. And we're also there to help and support too. So if parents have questions or anything, we're always there to, of course, answer the phone, guide you through, which I think is also pretty incredible. But is there anything else that you wanted to share with parents today before we part?
I think we did a good job of covering the basics. If any, like you said, if any questions come up, I'd love to, and I know that you would love to go more in depth and just explain and clarify. So we are more than happy to do that.
Yes, and if you want to sit next to your child in a pod, so that you can kind of see this in action. That's also a great way for parents to also kind of learn a little bit through like the modeling process, right? So you can see a teacher do it, then you can go ahead and try it too with your child, or kind of extend their learning even, is another great way to kind of support them from home too.
Yeah.
But I super appreciative of your time today, Jennifer. Thank you so much for chatting with us about balanced literacy.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, parents, if you do have any questions or are interested in signing up for a pod to see balanced literacy in action, feel free to visit our website at https://dailiespods.com. But thank you again, Jennifer, for your time, and parents, we will see you in class. Bye.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica.